All right, a bit of a longer one today going through osmoregulation, simply because there's a little bit of surrounding context that we really need to understand with osmoregulation, and there are about 3 feedback loops that we need to know in some detail as well. So to start us off, this is just a very quick look at the proportion of the human body that is made up of water. Now, roughly across both sexes, that's 58%, with a slightly higher water concentration in males and females, and that's just due to differences in the body composition, so between fats, between muscle tissue, and the relative water concentration of those types of tissues. When we talk about the body fluids themselves, there are some keywords that I just want to recap very quickly from year 11 human biology. And so the first one is intracellular fluid. Intracellular fluid is referring to stuff like the cytosol, so that fluid inside the cell. Now, extracellular fluid is any fluid that is outside of the cells. Plasma, obviously, is the fluid that we find in blood, and there's that fluid component of the blood. And then we also have this stuff known as intercellular fluid. So we've had intracellular fluid, which is the fluid inside the cell, but our intercellular fluid is a part of the extracellular fluid. It's a minor category within extracellular fluid, and it's including some of the things that we've looked at previously, such as lymph from the lymphatic system. We've looked at CSF so far this year. In year 11, we looked at synovial fluid, and we're also looking at some of the other fluid found in abdominal and chest cavities. So when we're looking here, just a quick recap, because each of these words can pop up in different exam scenarios and contexts. So we're looking intracellular being the cytosol, extracellular being anything outside the cells, and that extracellular fluid includes both plasma and intercellular fluids. So our final sort of key word for today is osmolarity. Okay. Now, we know previously, in terms of osmoregulation, osmolarity, that things both enter and leave the bloodstream by those semi-permeable membranes that make up the capillaries. Now, we know water moves purely via osmosis, and that's from a high concentration to a low concentration, and that differs between the intracellular and extracellular fluid. So what osmolarity is the concentration of the solute relevant to the solvent within a particular solution. So we can say that the osmolarity of a solution has a high osmotic pressure when there is a really high amount of high amount of solute relevant to that amount of solvent. And we can also say that something has a low osmotic pressure when there is a low solute relevant to solvent. So up the top right now, we can see, maybe if I just change my color scheme ever so slightly and I get rid of that low osmotic pressure, and we make that, let's go with green here, we can see that on the left-hand side of the diagram up the top here, we have a low osmotic pressure as we have a low solute concentration relevant to the solvent. On the other side, we have that high osmotic pressure, and that again is because we have that high solute concentration relevant to solute or solvent. So another way of saying that is a really low water concentration. So this is just a very quick breakdown showing water intake throughout the day. On the left-hand side is about 2.5 litres per day, and that comes from a variety of different sources, mostly from the water that we drink, secondly from the food that we eat, and thirdly metabolic water from cellular respiration. Water loss, on the other hand, most of it is lost via our kidneys in our urine. A small amount is lost in the feces in order to make sure it's moist and can pass through the alimentary canal really easily. We also lose water from our lungs as we expire outwards, and finally through sweat, through our skin. So, why do we need water? Well, it's found in all tissues throughout our body, and one of the main things for us is that it helps transport nutrients and dissolve gases. So this is a little bit of a recap of year 11. A part of that transporting nutrient dissolved gases is also going to help us remove waste from the body. We do use it to keep our body temperature down, so this is simply referring to us sweating. And in terms of metabolic reactions, we actually need this water, and we need a certain balance of water as well to help us with some dissolved substances like sodium, potassium, or bicarbonate. So when we're talking about osmoregulation and the focus for our lesson moving forward, osmoregulation is a mechanism of homeostasis where we're looking at internal water and solute concentrations, and we're maintaining them despite changes in the external environment. So, the first sort of deviation from a normal osmoregulation pattern is dehydration, and it's probably the one that we hear about the most, especially in sporting guys, if you like. And dehydration, very simply, is where we have more water lost from the body than we have gained. So people tend to notice dehydration once they've already lost about 2% of their normal body water. So that's when things like thirst come into play. You're already slightly dehydrated. Now, some causes: excessive sweating, diarrhea, vomiting, maybe a reduced thirst reflex, and that can be found most commonly in older people. And what we observe with this is people who are really dehydrated have a severe thirst, they will have a lower blood pressure, and they will sometimes, in severe circumstances, might start to feel dizzy. And if this is not addressed and water isn't taken in, then it can lead to coma and death. So the opposite to dehydration, a little bit rarer this one, water intoxication. And this is when too much water is consumed. Now, why you'd be drinking too much water, that's a great question. But effectively using water instead of electrolytes following excessive dehydration can lead to water intoxication. Some symptoms of it very similar, in fact, to dehydration, but lightheadedness, so dizziness, headaches, vomiting, and then in extreme circumstances, again, coma and death. So when we're getting rid of water, okay, we can get rid of it in the form of excretion. And this is why we talk about the excretory system in year 11, so that you have a bit of an understanding when we get to year 12 about what these structures are. So in terms of excretory mechanisms in the body, we obviously have your skin with sweat, we have the alimentary canal passing out bile pigments and things like that. We have the lungs getting rid of carbon dioxide. This year we're adding water to that mix. And finally, the one that we really spoke about last year was the kidneys. Okay, and we've already mentioned today that the kidneys are the main way that our body removes water each day. But we don't really spend too much time in year 12 going through this structure. So what I want to do very, very quickly is talk about the kidneys and say, look, this is where 60% of our water is lost from the body. We do have water loss in other spots, but it's not so important. Within the kidneys, as a quick recap, we have 1.2 million in each kidney of these structures known as the nephron. Now, the nephron has a number of key structures within it, and while it's not explicitly in the curriculum this year, it is very important that you can refer to each of these structures as we're discussing some of the changes to osmoregulation. So please, I'm not going to go through it now, but make sure you review your nephron structure. So when we're finally talking about the nephron, final little bit of review of year 11, we have three main steps in the formation of urine. Okay, those being filtration, reabsorption, secretion. Now, if I was you, I would pause right now and I would make sure that my notes are up to date with urine formation and making sure that I'm clear across what each of these words mean, especially our second two, reabsorption and secretion, because I'll be using them quite significantly in a moment. So, to recap, here's another extra slide. I'm going to skip over it now, but it's just showing where things are reabsorbed and where things are secreted. Finally, this is some final statistics, but I'd just skip over this if I was you. So let's get into the important part. This here is our hypothalamus and pituitary gland that we've been looking at quite extensively throughout the endocrine component of this year. But what we're really focusing on now is the posterior pituitary gland. Now, the posterior pituitary is responsible for the release of two particular hormones, one being oxytocin, and the second one, which I put a red circle around already, is antidiuretic hormone, ADH. And ADH specifically targets the kidney tubules, so we'll talk about them in a second in a little bit more detail, but thinking back to your nephron, it's becoming more important now, and we're going to look at the function of ADH to start. So this here flows into our feedback loop mechanism. So what is the first stimulus? So our first stimulus is a high osmotic pressure, so a low water concentration, okay? This low water concentration or high osmotic pressure is detected by osmoreceptors found within the hypothalamus. This causes those neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus to stimulate secretion of ADH from the posterior pituitary. Now, if we jump back up here, we can see that, look, those neurosecretory cells run all the way through the infundibulum down into the posterior pituitary, where then they release that hormone from the axon terminals across into the bloodstream. It's then going to carry all the way through the bloodstream from the posterior pituitary down to the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts of the nephron. So if you just mention the nephron, you're going to leave some marks up on the table there. It's really important that we're quite distinct, quite clear with the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct of the nephron. What ADH then does is it increases the permeability to water. So I'm going to underline that in red actually to make that quite clear and distinct. So ADH, its job is to increase the permeability of water of the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct. What that is going to do and what the response is therefore going to be is an increased reabsorption of water from the filtrate into the blood. AKA, we're going to lose less water in the urine. Overall, this is going to have a negative feedback effect where we start with a high osmotic pressure. The final impact is going to be a decreased osmotic pressure or an increase to the concentration of water found in the blood. So a quick note, when the body is overhydrated, so those osmoreceptors that we spoke about in the hypothalamus, they detect a low osmotic pressure, and instead of going through the feedback mechanism that we've just spoken about, they are going to inhibit the secretion of ADH. And as a consequence, less water will be reabsorbed into the filtrate. And so this is just another alternative to this feedback loop that we've just discussed. Moving on down, here's another representation of this system. I just want to touch on aldosterone. Now, aldosterone isn't a true feedback loop as far as we're concerned, but what we are going to look at is some of the key structures which resemble that of a feedback loop. So, number one, aldosterone is released in response to a low blood pressure, low blood volume, low blood sodium ion levels, okay? Or, finally, high blood potassium ion levels. Now, similar to ADH, it acts on the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, and it increases the amount of sodium reabsorbed into the blood. Now, it does this by acting on the sodium-potassium pump that we spoke about when we discussed the nervous system. So what this ultimately results in is the movement of sodium being reabsorbed into the blood and the movement of potassium out of the blood into the filtrate. And what this does as a consequence is that water follows that sodium via osmosis, because we've changed the concentration of water both inside the blood and in the filtrate of the kidneys, and so water will then flow via osmosis into the blood itself. What this is going to do is it's going to increase blood pressure, it's going to increase blood volume. It will increase that sodium ion levels, however, because we're removing potassium in that sodium-potassium pump, it is going to decrease the blood potassium ion level. So what I've got here, again, I'm going to skip over it for now, but if you want, pause it. Just a very quick comparison between the effect of ADH and aldosterone. But the key part that we really want to focus on here is that they both increase that reabsorption of water in the kidneys. Different mechanism of doing so, but they both have the same outcome. So our final feedback loop and our final little piece for this lesson is thirst. So why do we feel thirsty? It is because we have a low water concentration, we're dehydrated, and what this means is that we have a high osmotic pressure. Same as with ADH, this is detected by osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, which sends, this time, a message to the cerebrum, okay? This is us feeling conscious or consciously feeling that we are thirsty. And what it does is your brain then prompts you to go and get a drink of water. Now, the modulator here is going to be the cerebrum. That's why I've only highlighted that portion there. And what your cerebrum does is it tells you you are thirsty, and your effector is your skeletal muscles. You walk to go and get a drink, or you raise that glass up to your mouth to have a drink of water. Okay? What ends up happening, water travels through your alimentary canal where it's absorbed back into the blood, and this decreases the osmotic pressure or increases the concentration of water.